Welcome to everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Amy Krappel, and I'm the director of the Center for European Studies at UF. Our Center for European Studies is a Department of Education Title VI National Resource Center and a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. Just a few housekeeping tips and notes before we begin. This discussion will be recorded and it will be available along with all of our previous talks at the UFCES website. We will have a Q&A session following the presentation, and we encourage questions, but we do ask participants to submit the questions through the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of the screen, and not through the chat window. It's just much easier to manage that way. So again, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We are discussing novel practices, exploring rehabilitation and reentry strategies in European prisons. This talk and the series of which it is part are sponsored by the Department of Education Title VI National Resource Center grant. This presentation is part of our program, European Studies Because, which explores non-traditional approaches to the study of Europe. And for details on this series and previous and upcoming talks, please visit ces.ufl.edu. And certainly, if anyone is interested in also making a presentation, just contact us and we would be happy to make a space for you. Our speaker today is Dr. Brooke, who is a senior lecturer in criminology in the Department of Sociology and Criminology and Law at UF. Her research interests revolve around the courts to corrections pipeline with special emphasis on the military service and crime relationship, specialty courts and diversionary programs. Some of her recent work has been published in Crime and Delinquency and the Journal of Offender Rehabilitation. She presently serves as program evaluator on several SAM, HSA, and BJA funded projects, examining the effectiveness of various juvenile and criminal justice diversion programs in the Central Florida region. As a reminder to all of our guests today, when you leave this event, you will be forwarded to an event survey, and we ask all of you to take just a moment to fill out that survey. It helps us to better understand the interests and outreach efforts that we make, and it helps us to ensure that future programs are designed with all of your interests in mind. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Erika Brooke.
Thank you, everybody, from taking time out of your afternoon to come explore this option here. You guys can see my full slides, right? Right, Carla?
Yes, we can.
All right, perfect. So I want to thank the Center of European Studies for extending me this opportunity. This presentation is really centered and focused off an initiative that I started in my Prisons and Jails course, focusing more on an international approach, specifically on corrections in Europe. And so from that, I will be presenting on some of the novel, innovative, creative, rehabilitative, and reentry practices that are currently being conducted in Europe, and then kind of closing out our presentation with a little bit of food for thought and how it could apply maybe to the American correctional system. So just to start out, here is our agenda. So we're going to go over some justice system basics for those who may not be well versed in the criminal justice system, kind of the components that comprise that. We'll go over specifically the concepts of rehabilitation and reentry. We'll provide some prisoner statistics, taking a world view and seeing specifically how the incarceration rates vary across Europe. Then we'll go into the innovative practices, really structuring these practices around three models that have been proposed by Dr. Francis Cullen and colleagues, and ways that we should reimagine our American prison system. And so we'll go into that. So first and foremost, the criminal justice system in Europe and America, while they may have some varying components, they share a lot of similarities. So they're really comprised around three major components, being courts, corrections, and police. And when looking specifically at the corrections component, we see that it is parsed out into two major areas. First one being community corrections. And this is where you see probation, parole, essentially sentences, correctional sentences that are served within the community. Next, you see institutional corrections, which is what we'll really focus on here in this discussion. So prisons, jails, detention centers. So, and now discussing kind of rehabilitation and reentry. These are two separate concepts. So in focusing specifically on rehabilitation, the goal of it is really to change factors that are causing offenders to break the law. And so that's really what we're focused on here. And so understanding the causes of crime help us to do that, and understanding that if our rehabilitation initiatives are not rooted in criminogenic risks, that we really reduce our opportunity to be able to do that. But this isn't always an easy approach, especially for folks who don't want to change, or maybe who have spent their whole life in a career of crime. So the major concerns that we have for rehabilitation is really, how do they translate into prisons? They're hardly therapeutic settings. And then also we have to look at our staff and kind of their lack of expertise on therapeutic models, on counseling, on any type of rehabilitative initiatives, and then looking at the organizational resources and if they're able to deliver these effective interventions. And so considering these as we move across, also understand that programs, when we're talking about rehabilitation, they must be integrated and holistic, taking into account various economic, social, physical factors. Reentry is a part of rehabilitation, so it's a component of it, but it has a specific purpose itself. So reentry process is really focused on transitioning offenders from institutions into the community. And sometimes that may be continuing on a community correction sentence. But there's two major components that we see in reentry. So there's the correctional component, and then there's that reintegration component. And so the correctional component is really focused on reducing the likelihood of recidivism. So we want to focus on reentry so we can reduce that likelihood of recidivism. But also there's that reintegration component that's really focused on helping released inmates assimilate back into society. So assuming those societal roles and kind of eliminating some of those negative collateral consequences that restrict a successful reintegration. So thinking about bars on employment or residences, things like that. So kind of to give you an overall view of what we'll be discussing, you need to understand how incarceration is shaped around the world. So specifically looking at our populations. So as you'll see on the left, you'll see the raw numbers of prisoners worldwide. And so this is the top 10 list. So these are the countries with the largest amounts of correctional populations. And so specifically in jails, prisons, and detention centers. So again, the institutional corrections. As you'll see on the top, the US leads this number at 2.1 million. And the only representation that we see from Europe within this list is Russia. Next, in the right, we look at the prison population rates. And this is really helpful to make comparative analyses, okay? And so what they have is the rate per 100,000 individuals. And so you see, again, the US leads that with our rates being 655, but you also see the British Virgin Islands, and you see, again, Russia making these lists. But this list looks very different, or it adds in some additional countries that we didn't see in looking at the raw populations. So keep this in mind as we move through the presentation, kind of getting a worldview on where we're at. So specifically diving further into Europe, I want to take a closer look at the populations within the European Union. So this is from 2018. So I know there's been a few shifts within that union, but as of 2018, we can see the visual representation of raw prison populations and seeing how this looks across specifically the European Union at the time, and understanding that in context, the US is having a population of 2.1 million. So looking at how the populations across Europe do vary. And then similarly, looking at the European Union in 2018, looking at the the rates of imprisonment and how they vary across each country. So again, some context here is that the US is at 655 for their rate. So again, incredibly higher than what we see in Europe. So some other notable European countries that do not fall into the Union, Norway and Switzerland. We'll talk about a few of their practices in here. Again, very low populations when we compare it to the US. So Norway at just a little over 3,000 compared to our 2.1 million, a rate of 63, and then Switzerland a little closer to 7,000, but a rate of 81 is what we see there. So over the next couple of slides, we're going to be talking about the different innovative approaches. And so I pulled these practices based on 3 central models. So a virtuous model, a female model, and a healthy prison model. And so I'll go into what each one of those models is, but I'll share the approaches and then basically what type of offenders that this model and approach would best apply to. So the first one being the virtuous model. And so in his book, Cullen and his colleagues talked about different proposals, different models to reshaping the American prison. And one of those was the virtuous model. And so the virtuous model combines restorative justice and the rehabilitative ideal. And so within that, a prison that would take on this model would have a few components. So such as idleness within the facility would be eliminated. There would be constant engagements. And then these activities that inmates were engaging in would have a restorative purpose, so mending their bonds with society. Also, it would emphasize contact with virtuous people. Inmate programming would be based on criminological research, so evidence-based practices. And then the standard of living would be high as possible. And most importantly, our correctional officers would function as correctional officers, as officers facilitating that rehabilitation and correction of behavior. And so a good way that we see this model being employed today in terms of violent offenders is in Norway's Halden prison. And so this may be the facility that individuals are most familiar with. Anytime we talk about a prison in Europe, this is always the number one that hits across the US media sources. It's cited as the world's most humane prison. It has garnered a lot of interest across the world. Specifically in the US, we've had a lot of researchers, both at the institutional level, research organizations, et cetera, tour this facility and really bring back information and inspiration in how we can apply some of these philosophies, practices to our American correctional system. So this prison in particular, it opened in 2010. It's a supermax prison, okay? And so that means nearly half are in prison for violent crimes like murder, assault, rape, and a third are in for smuggling or stealing drugs. And so it's rehabilitation focused. It really looks more like a college dorm. It really resembles something you would see in the IKEA store. And the idea is that it simulates life outside of the prison. Just because you're incarcerated doesn't mean the conditions need to be harsh and cold. They can look just like it would in the community. And so within the facility, it has 251 inmates, so a much smaller facility than we would see here in the United States. And it's comprised of 3 units, A, B, and C. And that A unit is really the unit that's the most restrictive. And so that's where inmates are housed that either require close psychiatric or medical supervision, or maybe they've committed a crime that would make them very unpopular across the populations in unit B and C. So as you can see here in this picture, inmates, they have their own flat screen TV in their room. They have their own bathroom facility, private bathroom facility, and they share communal areas together. And so this prison is really focused on 4 major pillars: normality, dynamic security, reintegration, and humanity. And so in focusing on normality, administrators really review or view the removal of people from society. That's the punishment. So being taken out of the community, away from your families and friends, that's the punishment. Thus, the prison should really look like the community. And an example of this is their commissary, which is where the inmates can buy items that aren't provided by the institution. So snacks, any extra, items. It looks like a grocery store. So imagine stepping into a Publix per se. So it really takes on that approach. So that way the inmates are engaging in items, activities, situations that reflect the community in which they came from. The second part of this is the dynamic security portion. So this model emphasizes interpersonal relationships with prisoners. Okay, so really interacting one-on-one, taking that personable approach. And so the way that they have it designed is that 2 or 3 inmates are assigned a contact officer. And that contact officer really serves as an inmate's, as their mentor, kind of helping them to successfully reintegrate back into society. And so with this, correctional officers undergo an intensive training program. So in order to be a correctional officer in this facility, staff undergoes 2 years of full-time training. And so this training isn't just focused on defensive tactics, policies, procedures, kind of like what we see here in the US, where it's a few weeks. It actually includes curriculum on psychology, criminology, social work. So really taking this holistic approach. And so the idea here is that the officers are really kind of focused on social work type of practices. So the next component, reintegration. And so this starts on day 1. Officers mentor inmates from the day that they arrive, giving them advice on how to integrate back in society and how to plan for the future. Vocational training inside this facility, it mirrors what we see in the free world. So they have opportunities such as car mechanics, graphic designers, music training to include producing, recording music, restaurant prep, where they allow inmates to handle knives. They also offer the ability for families to come visit prisoners overnight. So they have special units designed to house a family overnight. And then lastly, humanity. And so this is really the cornerstone of this model. Items such as respect and dignity are really emphasized within this prison. So officers playing cards with inmates or going on walks with them, kind of treating them like decent human beings. That is really the foundation for this model. And this model has shown in the research to be effective. So we see about a 20% recidivism rate after 2 years compared to the US that we see about 60%. So it definitely is a little bit of promising to kind of highlight some of the humaneness further. I've chosen a couple of images to really highlight some of the concepts that I just discussed. So first one you see on the left, 2 prisoners there dressed in non-uniforms, engaging in some art activity, right? Some rehabilitative programming there. You see how in the second picture, how the correctional officers interacting with the prisoners, playing together. And then lastly, you see a picture towards your right, highlighting the communal kitchen. And so these are the types of facilities that these individuals live in within this prison. So there are some additional contextual factors that we need to consider with this facility. Is first the cost. So the cost at this facility, it's $98,000 per year per inmate, as compared to the US, in which our facilities cost about $25,000 to $33,000, depending on the facility per year per inmate. So almost 3 times the cost here. But it has been argued that if we were in the US to incarcerate our citizens at a similar rate as Norwegians do, So instead of, 655, more like 75 per 100,000, we could save a lot of money. We could still spend that same amount, so 98,000 per inmate, and still save about $45 billion a year. So that's been one thing to consider is the cost. Also, considering the differences in penalties. So in Norway, there's no death penalty and there are no life sentences as compared in the US, where we have both of those punishments, which ensure a higher cost as individuals live longer. And then finally, some criticisms of the model have been really related to public perception. So there's kind of this concern that when you see these images, that inmates are living in luxury, and there's really a disregard for the victim's point of view by having inmates live in something that would equate to a dormitory. So definitely something to think about. This is a perfect example of the virtuous model and how it can be utilized with violent offenders. So next, we're going to kind of switch gears and talk about the female model. And so as would be suggested in the title here, is that Cullen and colleagues recommended a specific model tailored towards female prisoners. As much as our research has identified that there are very big differences between male and female prisoners, and our facilities should account for such differences. And so specifically in a female-centered model, we would want to focus on identifying the risks and needs of female prisoners, wanting to keep our facilities to a small number of prisoners, emphasizing contact with children, focusing on skill development and empowerment in order to improve economic status post-release, and then also addressing trauma, substance use, and mental health inside the facility. So kind of to give you a little background of what the incarcerated female population looks like, we see that female prisoners, while they represent a small portion of prisoners worldwide, they are increasing, okay? And so we really see that the number of women that have been incarcerated worldwide since 2000 has increased 53%, whereas the number of male prisoners during the same time period have only increased almost 20%. So a huge gap between the two. There's several hypotheses as to why this is existing, some of it being liberation hypotheses or the chivalry hypotheses, but we really can't explain this increase due to population growth or due to the increase in prisoners. So researchers have suggested other theories for this increase, but nonetheless, it is something that is experienced both in the US correctional system and also with the European correctional systems as well. So in examining specifically the rate between US female prisoners versus European female prisoners, we see that the US, their rate is about twice the amount of female prisoners being housed in Europe. But we also need to keep in mind that some countries, for the crimes that women engage in, they're stigmatized, such as sex work, and that can make rehabilitation difficult both during imprisonment and after release. And then in many places, former female prisoners face greater stigma than men, regardless of the nature of the offense, and are more likely to be ostracized by their families and communities. So there is very much an emphasis for us to focus on gender-specific types of rehabilitative programming. So kind of to give you an idea of the characteristics, the backgrounds of female offenders that we see, compared to men, females who are incarcerated are more likely to be economically disadvantaged, regular users of drugs, and victims of abuse and maltreatment. We see that the majority of female prisoners are mothers, and they serve as the primary caretaker and providers of their children. Specifically, what we find is that prisoners, many female prisoners, have been convicted of nonviolent offenses, so property and drug are the most common we see. but these offenses are related to substance dependence or due to economic pressure and the need to provide for children and other family members. So in Europe, the median age of female inmates is 36 years. We see that female offenders in general, they face particular barriers in accessing programs and services in prisons, and they're often limited rehabilitation opportunities available to them. This is something we also see in the US. So I really wanted to highlight some approaches that are being conducted in Europe that have really hit on some of these important background characteristics that we're seeing of female prisoners. So first one we're going to highlight is in Germany. So Germany, they are deemed the most child-centered approach that they have. I'm going to highlight two programs in two different prisons. And so their emphasis on the mother-child bond is really in an effort to minimize the harm of a mother's imprisonment on children while ensuring women serve their sentence. Research has shown that imprisonment of a parent, especially a mother, can lead to increased risk of mental health, behavioral, emotional problems, poor academic performance, delinquency, et cetera, among children. But these, of course, are mediated by other factors such as age of the child, length of the mother's sentence, quality of the child's care arrangements, et cetera. But we do see some risk factors. So our first prison is in Frankfurt. It's a maximum security prison. It holds 833 inmates and 15 children. And so they have 3 custody levels. And so for high security prisoners, they have the ability to have their children live with them until they're age 3. For lower security prisoners, they can have their children live with them up to age 5. And so during the day, when these female inmates are conducting work, so performing work inside the facility, these babies can either stay with the mother. So if they're infants, they stay with the mothers, or if they're older children, they will actually go to nurseries or daycares, is what we would consider here in the US, either within the community or within the facility. So there's definitely care for the children there. Professionals assist with this care as well. They have a really interesting work release option. So in Germany, they take a different view on the work-life situation. So they view homemaking, house care, house maintenance the same as they would view women leaving the facility each day to go and work a job out in the community. So what they allow is that for mothers with children, they have the opportunity each weekday at 5 a.m. to leave the facility using public transportation, to go home and to get their children ready for school, get their children off to school. While the children are at school, they are at home focusing on, homemaking, house cleaning, cooking, appointment setting, etc. And they remain with their children until they are able to put the children to bed at night, after which they return to the prison. So a very unique opportunity in facilitating those mother-child bonds. So another model that they have is the Brandenburg prison. Similar concept, a little lower security, smaller units, and it features 16 women with children that are able to live with them until the age of 6. And so this is a different type of structure that we have here. It's an open unit. These are female offenders that have committed low-level offenses, and the facility being the open unit. They live in small studios, essentially, with their children. They don't wear uniforms. And we see similar models like this across Europe, where the maximum age of the child living inside the facility really varies. So the Netherlands can have children up to 9 months typically. They do have one program where children can be up to the age of 4. Sweden, they have models where children up to 12 months can live with mothers, and then Switzerland, Denmark, and Spain allow up to the age of 3. And so, like I said, this is an open unit. We see that in Europe, in fact, many female facilities are what we consider open units. And so that is essentially units without fences. So in addition to Germany, we see these models in Sweden, Finland, England, Norway, Spain, to name a few. And these open facilities really emphasize maintaining links with the community. And some prisoners are even held in small neighborhood prisons where they can have access to universal community services. And so kind of keeping with this same idea of maintaining the links with children and also the community, there are additional visitation options. So if the facility doesn't offer living with the child up to toddler years, or if the children are older, they also provide some alternatives. So for example, providing halfway houses where women can live with their children to ease that transition process, emphasizing family-friendly visiting facilities, maximizing the use of new technologies such as Skype and Zoom. So just like we're doing here, actually in Ireland, there's a female prison that allows prisoners between the hours of 5 and 7 p.m. To chat with their children via Zoom, to help them with homework, get them ready for bed, read bedtime stories, etc. So engaging in that communication. We have a few of those options like that via Zoom here in the US as well. We also have, in the US, we offer similar programs like we see in Germany in terms of infant children being able to reside with mothers while they're in prison. But we usually have an age gap on that, or an age cap, 24 months, usually low-level offenders, very small spaces. And we see those in New York and Indiana. They have some models there, but not as widespread as we're seeing here. Two other points that I do want to bring up. So within meeting with the children and keeping that communication and that connection with the community, Europe is a big proponent of conjugal visits, focusing on having the family connect and keep those bonds together over a weekend or whatnot. In the US, only about 6 states offer conjugal visits. So we see a big variation there. So Europe also emphasizes the location of facilities, which was a component of the female model. And so really focusing on that proximity to home. And so this is really a requirement in Germany. We find this is a huge emphasis for their correctional practices. We find that other countries will have some units that are attached to male prisons in order to be closer to their homes. So to the female prisoners' homes, they'll have female units attached to the male prisons. And we see that in Spain and France. Sweden also offers some sentences that can be served from home too, in an effort to keep those community bonds. Smaller facilities are emphasized in Europe. We see that the average size of a unit in Western Europe is 60, and they can range anywhere from 10 prisoners to 100 prisoners, depending on the facility. And this is in stark contrast compared to what we see in the US or even in Russia, where we'll have female prisons at a capacity of 2,000 prisoners or more. So lastly, I want to talk about this import model that Norway has really implemented in order to facilitate that connection between the community and female prisoners. And so it's called the import model. And this is where services related to health, education, employment, library, etc., are all imported and funded by the community. And so this really engages the community with the prisoners, and it also improves the public perception of prisons and prisoners. So lastly, we talked about in a few slides before about female characteristics and really emphasizing the employment opportunities and skill development to improve that economic status. And so vocational training. And so while we do that in the US, we have a lot of vocational training. Typically you see them around what you would consider female-centric types of employment, so cosmetology. But I really want to highlight an innovative approach that's being conducted in the UK on a training that really extends beyond these gender norms. And so it's the cycle mechanic training program, and it's supported and facilitated by Halfords, which is a major retailer in Europe for bicycles, for auto supplies. So think of like almost like an AutoZone or maybe even a Target over here. That's kind of the same outreach there. but they've started a program initially in a male facility and then brought it over to the female facility because they really wanted to extend this profession of bike mechanics that's been traditionally male dominated to female prisoners. And what's really unique about them and great about them is that they hire the folks they train after post release. And so while they're serving their sentence and taking on this training, they're giving back to the community, because what they do essentially in this program is they're reconditioning bikes to donate them to children, elementary school children in disadvantaged areas in the country. And so as of 2020, it's had a 100% success rate in terms of having all 12 folks that have been trained being hired on post-release. And so this is huge because we find that employment's a major issue for prisoners post-release, especially in Europe. It's been reported that women are 3 times less likely compared to men to secure work post-release. So this is really one way that a major retailer has partnered with an institution to provide opportunities. And so lastly, focusing on our healthy model. And so it's been said that in corrections in general, that individuals who income to the correctional systems are one of the most sickest populations that we see in a nation. Okay, so because of their closed confinement, disease spread is a concern. So HIV, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, tuberculosis, etc. And so as Colin and colleagues highlighted, a healthy prison is a great alternative. And this model, it emphasizes the community to prison back to the community link. And the model is really shaped by a group of healthcare professionals. So healthcare professionals essentially are guiding facility operations. And we're keeping in mind health as we're moving through the facility. And so access to health services that are delivered by the same agencies we would see in the community are administered to inmates as well. So we have the same agency servicing both inmates and our community populations. And so I want to highlight a few of those practices that meet this model here. And so understanding that drug use occurs in secrecy and varies by country and institution as far as a percentage or a rate. Very common that we see this inside the US facility as well. So in addition to drug use inside the facility, we see a lot of folks come into our prison system that have used drugs, alcohol, etc. So we see that a big related factor. And so the drug treatments that are offered in European prisons really mirror many of the practices that we do here in the US, such as chemical detox, therapeutic communities, opioid substitution treatment, etc. But we're going to highlight a couple of innovative practices that they do that we do not do in the US. So although intravenous drug use in prison seems to be less frequent than we see in the community, each episode of injection is far more dangerous than the outside due to the lack of sterile IVs, the high prevalence of sharing, and already widespread infectious diseases. So activities such as IV drug use still continue inside the prison. And as we kind of noted a few slides earlier, per the World Health Organization, at least 75% of women entering European prisons are estimated to have problems with drug and alcohol use. We see similar proportions for males as well. But interestingly, women prisoners are more likely than male prisoners to inject drugs. And so we see that in the European prison system. So they have implemented programs that allow needle exchanges, needle and syringe exchange programs. It's something that we have here in the US within the community, though. We haven't seen it in a prison system. We don't allow it in a prison system. So it's really innovative to see them conducting it here within Europe. And so specifically Spain, Luxembourg, and Germany. So at one time, Germany had 6 of these programs, but it has reduced only to one program inside a female prison. And that was really due to political controversy. And so elected officials taking office that really had a zero tolerance for drugs platform. And so as a result, they have been taken out of the facilities in Germany, all but one. So other institutions offer similar program, more like offering disinfectants, and mainly what we see is bleach being used as an option to clean injection equipment. So we see that across 8 countries in Europe that is available. We have found when the WHO, the World Health Organization, actually did a review of the needle exchange program, they found no reported increase in drug use and no negative unintended consequences, so such as these needles being used as a weapon. So these programs have shown to be beneficial within the prison system here in Europe, at least. And then some programs, while they haven't gotten on board, they've offered a little bit of an alternative. And so lastly, a different kind of approach away from this is in Greece, something unique and innovative that they do there is that NGOs, so non-governmental organizations, they are the only provider of drug treatment in prison. And so that's very interesting that it doesn't have a government influence, if you will. And so what's unique about this organization is that they offer different types of treatment. So counseling to inmates, they have specific rehabilitation units, and they offer reentry centers for prisoners who are being released to kind of continue with that treatment. They serve about, across those 3 options, about 2,000 prisoners a year. And this is the same program that is utilized in the community. So this is the same provider that provides communities drug treatment. It's the same provider that is assisting inmates. So that's really an interesting initiative that we see there, something that Colin and colleagues highlighted in wanting to really emphasize a healthy prison. So some key takeaways here is that we looked at various approaches within this talk about how to address rehabilitation and reentry. We see that it varies across country. We see a lot of similarities between some of the practices we do within the US, but some innovative options as well. And understanding that the application of practices really vary by structure, functional, and cultural differences across nations. While, for example, Norway's Halden prison is great, not sure that taking that prison and placing it in the US, that it would have similar success. But some components of that model may be able to make its way into the American correctional system to improve that. So with that, I leave with any questions.
I do see we have a couple of questions in the Q&A. Are you able to see those?
Let me see here. All right. Okay, so first one. So you mentioned that the virtuous model is partly derived conceptually from restorative justice, as restorative justice is a theory of justice that defines accountability based on the needs of victims. Are inmates ever required / encouraged to explore the impact of the harm that they caused or make specific attempts to repair that harm in a virtuous system? Or is the system only really concerned with the needs of offender and broader community? That's a very good question, Eric. So in the virtuous model, there are emphasis for making that amends with communities. And so being able to go ahead and speak with the victims of the crime or their families, being able to repair some of that through specific programming. So there is an emphasis on that there in that model. Okay, so one comment here. Here are my thoughts. I believe that the differences between American and European criminal environments begin well before the prison gate. Do you also investigate the types of crime statistics while trying to look into the correctional models or possible perspective that the community relate to them? How the cultural differences and perception of ethics can help or impede the application of various models that you talked about? That's an absolute great question. And as I was putting this together, these aren't necessarily comparative practices, right? So it's not that, oh, they're doing something great and that works in Germany or it works in Norway, so it's going to work here in the same as the US. We have different motivations as to why we engage in crime. If you just look at society in general, we're a very capitalist society, so it's very different. If you look at our makeup, we're very culturally diverse, as in some countries in Europe, they're more homogenous. So you